Hello out there in Radio Land. This is Michael. This is Street Preacher's Corner, a podcast where we consider the past a window into the present. And that intro is particularly apropos today because I'm going to offer you a cautionary tale from church history involving two groups of Christians, the Puritans and the Quakers. Now, if you're an American and I say Puritan, you probably think of the Mayflower, and then that's legitimate. They were the Mayflower folks, and we'll get into that. If I say Quaker, you probably think of the guy on the outside of the oatmeal box, and there's nothing I can do about that. Their marketing has worked quite well. Both groups, the Quakers and the Puritans, have their origins in Europe. They have a very prominent presence in English history. And both groups found themselves, or they wound up in sort of pre-colonial America in the late 1600s. And when these two groups met, these are two groups of Christians that have slightly different beliefs. We're going to talk about the slightly different beliefs they had. When these two groups encountered each other, well, like I said, it's a cautionary tale. Now, by way of backdrop, I don't know how familiar you are with church history. I always sort of assume some things, and then I try not to assume some things. By way of backdrop, by the early 1500s, Europe was crawling out of a 1,000-year period, roughly, of Catholic domination and of popish superstition and just horrible, horrible things. The Renaissance, but the 1500s, early 1500s, mid 1500s is a great time as far as coming out of the dark. The Renaissance is happening, and the printing press was a thing, and God's true church, people that have been saved by grace through faith, those people, God's true church, are just starting to get back on their feet after just a millennia of popish oppression and just beat down. Now think about this. The church never died out, despite the best attempts of people to kill us off. The church never died out because Jesus said it wouldn't. But man, she went through some horrific times. And in the 1500s, you had people who had a Bible in their hand for the first time in centuries. I don't know if you ever thought about that, what your life would be like as a Christian if you didn't have the scriptures. But anyway, for the first time, these guys had a Bible. And so the brethren now saw sort of a resurgence of discussing doctrine, of discussing Bible things. And you had guys that were very prominent people, and they were writing back and forth, and they were having these discussions for the first time, discussions that they couldn't have 100 years ago. And they were rediscovering some ideas that had been considered before. They were rediscovering some truths that had been considered before. They were remaking some mistakes that had been made before. Now, one of these ideas is the school of thought, a sort of a large body of doctrines that we would tend to call Calvinism, with its origins in John Calvin and those guys over in Switzerland. I'm not going to get into a deep dive on Calvinism and how it works. Just suffice to say, the Puritans were Calvinists, so that's a big part of the story. Now, but Calvinism itself, that whole Swiss school, didn't happen in a vacuum. So one of the things that, for centuries, folks have been told by the organized religion, the visible religion, the church they could see, the church that built buildings, not the church that was meeting in caves, but the church that everybody could see, the organization that everybody could see that called themselves a church. For centuries, people have been told that the way to approach God was through a hierarchical priesthood structure, a politically connected priesthood. They were the gatekeepers between you and the God who made you. There was no salvation outside the Church of Rome, and so you had to come through Rome, you had to come through Rome's way. And people have been told that for several hundred years. Well, now that you have access to the scriptures, now that people, somebody in your village has a copy of the Bible, you can read for yourself, and you can see that's a kind of a stupid notion. And the idea of a mass equality before God, the idea that the foot is level at the cross, the idea that people have different positions in life, people have different stations in life, people have different responsibilities in life. Before God, all men are equal before God's justice, and all men are equal before God's mercy. That was an idea that the church had sort of lost. I'm not going to say nobody in the world held onto that, but I'm going to say, by and large, if you stop the average quote-unquote Christian on the street in the 1400s and asked them that was an idea that was foreign to them. But that was an idea that the Calvinists had rediscovered, and so good for them. Now, let me just say, and the Puritans also, because they were Calvinists, I'm probably going to use those terms interchangeably before it's all over with, but let me just say this. While I find a lot to disagree with, when it comes to Calvinists and Puritans, I also found a lot to admire them for. In fact, the idea of human equality, the idea that everybody's equal, at least in some areas of life, that puts them at odds not only with the Pope, but sometimes with the King. Now, as an American, there are ideas that I take for granted. These ideas aren't new, but there's ideas I take for granted. These ideas didn't show up in the 1500s, but there are ideas that I take for granted. The idea that no man's above any other, that sort of thing. That is a Puritan idea. That's a Calvinist idea. That's an early church idea, but it's rediscovered by the Calvinists and the Puritans. And those ideas became part of the political philosophy and the political presuppositions that made my country. And so those things first found expression in Puritan writings. The Puritans also wrote a bunch of stuff. So Hume, in his book, The History of England, says, here's the quote, "So elaborate was the authority of the crown at the time that the precious spark of liberty had been kindled and was preserved by the Puritans alone, and it is to this sect that the English owe the whole freedom of their Constitution." Now, all that backdrop was for a reason, and all that context is for a reason. All that is there so that you can see and you can understand why my Puritan friends here had such a hard time with Henry VIII. If you're not familiar with Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce so he could marry some other girl he had his eye on. The Catholic Church was in charge of divorces at the time, whatever, and they would not grant him a divorce. And so he broke away from the Catholic Church, formed the Church of England with himself as the head. So the Puritans went from having a pope in the world that they didn't think was the head of the church to now having a king in the world that they didn't think was the head of the church. And so he announced himself as the head of the church, and the Puritans made no bones about it. The king is just another man, and Christ is the head of the church. And that made them run afoul of not only Henry, but pretty much everybody that came after him. So what happens over the next several decades, because Henry wouldn't stand for that sort of thing, and neither would his followers, the guys that took the throne after him. What happens in the next several decades? You have Puritans fleeing England when a hostile monarch is on the throne, and then returning when a less hostile monarch takes over. So Henry was replaced by Edward, who was replaced by Lady Jane Grey. During all that, there's waves of Puritan exiles that come and go out of England. Lady Jane Grey was replaced by Mary Tudor in 1553. Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary, and this girl's a piece of work. So she took the throne, and she was a monster. She was a rabid Catholic. She was a major player in the Inquisition. She literally burned hundreds of her own subjects at the stake for refusing to go to Mass, for refusing to pay homage to the Pope, refusing to be, good little Catholic. She had them killed. So in 1558, Elizabeth takes the throne from Mary, and Elizabeth walks into a very delicate situation because after centuries or decades of this back and forth thing, you had a country that was half Catholic and half Protestant. And the Pope would, if you push things too far, the Pope would tell the Catholic in your country that they no longer had to pay any allegiance to you, and the fact that they would be damned to hell if they did pay allegiance to you. Now, that's nonsense, and people ought to know better, but they didn't know better. So Mary walks in a situation where half her country is Catholic, her country is quote-unquote Protestant. And if you dig a bit into Mary's mindset or what she actually thought about things, she's officially Protestant, but she didn't really care about the details of the issues. She just wanted the strife to cease. She really didn't see what all the fuss was about. In fact, there's a quote from her. It says, "Why make such an ado about the Mass? Cannot you attend it as if you would a play?" So she didn't care. So in the interest of unity, what Elizabeth does, she has a country half Catholic, half Protestant. What she does is she sets in place a system that probably meant well, but what it did is it made things worse. Because remember, as the Queen of England, she's the head of the church, right? Henry had already set that up as being a thing. Here we are decades down the road. They're still considering themselves the head of the church. They still consider themselves to have authority over what goes on in the local New Testament church. So as the head of the church, she mandated a church system based off the English prayer book, and she mandated a license to preach. So you had to get permission from the government to preach outside or preach inside. Well, obviously, this offended the Puritans, and many of them refused to get a license. Some of them were fined, some were jailed. Matter of fact, John Bunyan, if you ever read Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan wrote that in a jail cell. Not on pen and paper, but on these little, they bring him milk, and they have this little paper thing over the top of the milk to keep the flies out. He saved up those papers, and he wrote Pilgrim's Progress on top of those papers, in a jail cell. He had gone to jail for refusing to take a license to preach. Some of these guys were executed. 1572, John Knox had passed away, and that same year, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre had happened. If you don't know about the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, it was the Catholic Church killing Protestants in Paris and in areas around Paris. 3,000 people died in Paris. 8,000 people died in other cities during the Feast of St. Bartholomew. And all that happened in 1572. So the Puritans are looking over the border at France, or looking over the channel at France, and they're going, "Oh, that could happen here very, very easily if this thing goes sideways just a little bit." And it did go sideways just a little bit. For example, in 1583, John Copping and Elias Thatcher were executed. They burned at the stake. Thacker has got a great quote from Thacker. He said he's declared that unpreaching ministers are like dumb dogs. Now think about that quote for a second. Dumb as in they don't speak, not dumb as in they're stupid. Unpreaching ministers are like dumb dogs. So the reason you keep a dog around, I don't know why we have these dogs around the house. I don't know why sometimes. But one thing they are good at, they're good at barking when nothing's there. But they're really good at barking when something is there. When there is some sort of perceived danger, something isn't right on the property, they'll go to making a bunch of racket. Well, that's a lot of instances, that is the case of a minister, that is the case of a preacher of the gospel, to warn, to sound the alarm, to take the platform God has given him, whether it be a street corner, whether it be inside a church building, and warn people about the danger. And so Elias Thacker said that a minister that wouldn't preach is like a dog that won't bark. Of no use whatsoever. In 1593, John Greenwood and Henry Barrow and John Perry were all put to death for preaching in public without a license. So that was going on, and the Puritans were watching this go on, even while they were writing letters to the king and writing letters to the queen, and lobbying to have the religious freedom that they felt like they should have, according to the Bible. So when Elizabeth dies, King James takes the throne in 1603. It didn't help. Now, as fond as I am of my King James Bible, as much as I believe it is inspired and inerrant and infallible, my brethren who hold that same position sometimes will make an error, I think. They will look to King James as some sort of inspiration, as if some sort of hero in the story, and I don't think that's justified. I really, he's a great guy, but you don't want to put him above. First of all, he didn't do any translating. At the end of the day, James of Scotland was a politician. He was a king. He still considered himself the head of the church. And it's just like the Pirate King said in Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance. Many a king on a first-class throne, if he wants to claim his crown his own, must manage somehow to get through more dirty work than ever I do. I am an educated barbarian. So he is a politician. He's got to do stuff to make political things happen, and he still considered himself the head of church. He still considered himself having power and authority over other believers. It's all right, man. We're all friends here. I'm just admonishing my people a little bit. I know guys that went to England and they went to King James's grave, and they're like, "Oh, what a great man! Oh, he gave us the Bible." Okay, he was a man, and he was in the right place in history to do the right thing, and he did the right thing. But I'm not going to give the guy more credit than he needed. For no other reason, that's when anyway. So by the early 1600s, the Puritans had endured decades of being kicked pillar to post, and in 1620, a group of them boarded the Mayflower and headed to the New World, fleeing oppression and persecution. I know I covered a lot of ground, but so get this fixed in your head. The Puritans, who were Calvinists in nature and doctrine, The Puritans had been mistreated and oppressed and not allowed to worship God according to their own conscience. And this was such a big deal to them. This was so important to them that they literally moved to the other side of the world to get away from it. Now that is important. That makes the story a bit more interesting. Now let's talk about the Quakers. The Quakers traced their breakaway to basically a single man named George Fox about 20 years after the Mayflower sailed. And Fox is credited with being the first person to publicly come out against the British slave trade. Now, interesting thing about slavery, it's weird to me that in America we're still having conversations about slavery, and it's been over with for 150 years. But anyway, Fox taught his people, and I believe he taught correctly, that while slavery wasn't expressly forbidden in Scripture, it's all throughout the Bible, that man stealing is something that's actually specifically called out as being forbidden in the New Testament, and that the British slave trade sort of hinged on the African slave trade, bringing Africans to England. It was very, very dependent upon man stealing. You got to go, you may not be the guy rounding everybody up and putting them in cages, but somebody's rounding people up and putting them in cages. These aren't men that have sold themselves into slavery to pay a debt, or men who have been captured on a battlefield in warfare. These are men that you went and you stole them, and now you're selling them, and that's expressly forbidden. And so George Fox taught that a Christian ought not own any African slaves. And apparently that was something that no one had ever thought about before, because George Fox, over and over again, this guy's given credit as being the first guy to publicly talk about that. And he taught his people that you ought not have slaves. And so as the Quakers became more and more vocal against slavery, they found themselves being harassed by a government that was making lots of tax money off of slavery. Britain, they eventually ended the slave trade. They used their sea power to bring a halt to it, or at least make it so difficult where it was no longer profitable. But for a while there, they were eyeball deep in it just like everybody else. So that's just how it goes. So some of the Quakers, when all the harassment going on and all the other stuff going on, they decided that it was time for them to head to the New World. Now, meanwhile, in the New World, the Puritan population had swelled. Mayflower had landed in 1620, and in 1625, another boat lands with a bunch of Puritans on it. And in 1630, some more came. So it looks like between 1620 and 1640, somewhere between 22,000 and 50,000 Puritans made their way to modern-day America. Most of them with evangelism on their mind. You read the Mayflower Compact. There's a clause in there about getting the gospel spread out among the heathen in this new world. In fact, in 1648, so this would be 28 years after the Mayflower had sailed, they founded the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England. And Oliver Cromwell, who was the Lord Protector of the realm and definitely not the king, another story for another time. Oliver Cromwell made the churches in England contribute to get the gospel out in New England to the natives and everything else that were living there in Massachusetts area. He made the churches in England contribute money so the gospel could go out in America, and so that's a good deal. Now you would think, though, if everything I've told you about the Puritans, they sound like great guys, and I would say for the most part they are. Hence the cautionary tale. You would think that for the most part the Puritans being good guys, you would think that when they heard, because remember that the Quakers are on their way. You would think that when the Puritans heard that some of their brothers in Christ were fleeing to the New World to escape persecution, it would have been taken as good news. It would have been taken as the more the merrier. You'd think they would welcome the fellowship. You think they would welcome the help. You would think that despite their theological differences, the Puritans would have welcomed the Quakers when they got here. And that, dear friends, did not happen. Now, let me take this minute here to point out what the big deal is, the theological difference between Quaker and Puritan. After the Puritans left England, when the Puritans left England, pretty much everybody was Calvinist because that was the major school of thought. That's the guy that was writing all the books. That's the guy that was putting out all the literature. But after the Mayflower sailed, an idea took root in England called free graceism. And so while the Puritans believed that, and this is I know I'm oversimplifying everybody's beliefs here for brevity's sake. Just cut me some slack here. That the Puritans believed that God had foreordained from the foundation of the world who would be saved and who would be lost. The Quakers believed that idea that salvation was available to all. Now this made the Quakers rank heretics of the worst sort in Puritan eyes. The idea that man in his unregenerate, unconverted condition could choose God, to this day, is an idea that Calvinists generally reject. Puritans also believed, and this is crucial for other things that we're going to talk about later, Puritans also believed that they were Israel, that they had replaced the nation of Israel as God's chosen people, and that they were a chosen people charged by God with establishing a Old Testament style theocracy in the New World. And with that burden of being right came the responsibility of keeping a heresy like free gracism from finding a foothold in the New World. They saw it as their duty to keep the idea of free grace and salvation being available anyway. They saw it as their duty to stamp out this idea. And the easiest way to stamp out an idea, at least short term, is to stamp out the people that are preaching it. Now, does any of this sound familiar? Of course it does. I mean, we are right. We're on God's side. We have to stand up against the things that stand up against God as determined by us. And you ought to be careful, man. In 1 Timothy 6:3, it talks about how good doctrine produces godliness, but bad doctrine produces self-righteousness and religious thugs, and bad doctrine produces bad behavior. So one of the things you got to consider, independent Baptists, pay attention for a second. One of the things you have to consider is that does your doctrine produce godliness? So if you say, well, we've got these standards and we're right, we got to enforce these standards. Okay, fine. But is the way you're doing it, does it make you a jerk? Does it make you carnal? Does it make you schismatic? Does it make you separate yourself unnecessarily from your brethren over disagreements? And if it does, then I would point to you that 1 Timothy 6:3, you might want to consider that your doctrine might not be so hot. Another sermon for another time. Every door opens another door, as they say. So anyway, the first recorded Quakers to arrive were two women who named Mary Fisher and Ann Austin, who arrived in 1656, about a generation after the Mayflower. Now, the Puritan governor of Massachusetts was a guy named John Endicott, and he declared that these women, that they were heretics, and he would not allow their ship to dock, but he sent local officers out to search their ships and to search them. By searching them, I mean all of their clothes were removed, and every inch of them was searched looking for a witch mark, a blemish or a scar that would establish these free grace Quakers as being in league with the devil. Now, it sounds ridiculous sitting here in the 21st century that this happened, but these were men just like you and just like me, and they'd gotten off the rails just a little bit, and all of a sudden they're doing things that are just ungodly, and they're doing things that don't even make sense. Mary Fisher and Ann Austin were moved from the ship to a jail. The window of the jail was boarded up so that no one could talk to them. They would have starved if a local innkeeper hadn't provided food for them. The religious books were burned. They were given no food, no pen, no ink, no paper, no candle. So in a dark jail cell, being slid food underneath the door for the crime of daring to come to the New World and believe something different than the Puritans, to believe something different than the established religious hierarchy. Any of this sound familiar? It should. After 5 weeks in a cell, they were taken back to the ship. Local officials confiscated their bed and their Bibles, and the ship's captain was told to take them back to England and allow no one to interact with them along the way. About a month later, 8 more Quakers arrived, and after the same treatment, except this time it was 11 weeks in jail, they also were sent back to jolly old England. John Endicott, who was, like I said before, was governor of the settlement, told the Quakers, quote, "Take heed ye break not our ecclesiastical laws, for then ye are sure to stretch for a halter." When they asked for a copy of these ecclesiastical laws that they had violated, the Puritan governor had them whipped. 1656, a law was passed that any Quaker arriving would be committed to the house of correction, severely whipped, kept constantly at work, and none suffered to converse or speak with them. Any Puritan found with Quaker books would be fined, and the books would be destroyed. Anyone defending or befriending a Quaker would share their fate. Land of the free, right? We came here to be free. We came here to worship God according to our own conscience. One Puritan, Nicholas Upshaw, he lobbied for charity towards their Quaker brethren, because he considered them brethren. He was fined and imprisoned for missing church and banished. An Indian who saw all this said, quote, "What a God have the English who deal so one with another about their God." You ever wonder why Jesus said that all men would know that we are his disciples by our love one for the other? Love is not tolerance of error. Love is love. Charity is charity. And our failure to distinguish that, once again, independent Baptists, pay attention for a second. Our failure to draw those distinctions and our failure to extend charity towards our brethren with whom we disagree, and some of whom are legitimately wrong, but our failure to extend charity towards those guys proves that maybe we're not the good disciples we think we are. And so there's that. Governor Endicott upped his game as more Puritans arrived. It went from fines and imprisonment and book burnings and banishment to burning holes through Quakers' tongues, to cutting off Quaker ears, to dragging Quakers through the street, whipping their backs. 4 Quakers were publicly hung in 1657 for heresy. The doctrine of free grace was called, quote, "a dangerous and a horrid tenet." In an act enacted in 1658, William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson were hung in 1659, Mary Dyer in 1660, and William Little in 1661. Now, certain Puritan pastors were regularly dispatched to talk to the condemned and persuade them to repent of their heresies. Once again, a Catholic trick. Mary Dwyer, though, I mentioned her a minute ago. I mentioned that she died in 1660. She is an interesting one. She was condemned not to be hung, but they were going to put her on the gallows along with some men that they were going to hang. They're going to put a noose around her neck, and they were going to drop the trap underneath everybody except her, because they were a little embarrassed about the fact they were hanging a woman, I guess. And so they dropped the trap. She's under every consideration was, as far as she knew, she was going to hang that day. They put her on the gallows. They dropped the trap on everybody except her. And once those other guys that were hung with her were dead, they escorted her back to the jail, and they banished her from the town. They said, "You can't come back." So the following spring, she came back, and she was arrested again, and she demanded to be hung. She says, "I came in obedience to the will of God, desiring you to repeal your unrighteous laws, and that is my earnest request now. I told you before that if you refused to repeal them, the Lord would send others of his servants to witness against them." Now, while this very Catholic-ish, Inquisition-ish behavior is going on, it's perpetrated by the very same people who had fled exactly this sort of treatment. Some Quakers had returned to England and got the king to pass an order to release all Quakers, and made religious liberty a condition to renew the royal charter with the colony. Isn't that ironic? That they'd fled a king who was heavy-handed, and then they wound up going back to that king to get him. He wouldn't renew the royal charter, which means they would not be eligible for British protection from whatever happens next. And so it's either you're gonna write into your laws religious liberty, or not going to renew your charter. Well, interesting thing. There was a guy who was the chief bishop in Boston, and he was also the chief persecutor of Quakers. His name was John Norton, and in 1663 he died. Now, what happened? He'd been burning people, he'd been killing people, he'd been hanging people. He came home, walked into his house, put his hand up against the fireplace, told his wife and kids, "The hand of the judgment of the Lord is upon me," and then he fell over dead. Of course, England, the king had passed this thing saying we're not going to renew your charter, and England's way over there, and we're way over here, and the Puritans were not done yet. In fact, in 1675, Quaker church services were outlawed. In 1677, constables were allowed to break into Quaker homes if they suspected them of holding church in their homes. Men and women were seized, dragged to jail, fed bread and water, fined, and publicly whipped. Men and women both were stripped from the waist up and branded. Some of them were sold as slaves. Now that's irony for you, because one of the key tenets of Quaker theology is that no man has the right to own, to steal a man and sell him into slavery. And that's exactly what was done to them by their brethren, by men who are as saved as me and as saved as you if you're saved. In other words, literally everything Rome had done to the Puritan ancestors, the Puritans did to the Quakers. John Wilson, he was the assistant to John Norton, the guy that had died in front of his fireplace. As a quote from him said, "I would carry fire in one hand and faggots in the other to burn all the Quakers in the world." He was really into it. He was really into it. Now we could go on and on of examples of abuse. It's very well documented. Trust me, I'd pour through hundreds of pages of this to get this. I don't know if you've been tracking the dates, but the last date I gave you was 1675. And in 15 years from 1675, another fun little chapter in Puritan history begins, the Salem witch trials. And the Salem witch trials were overseen by some of the same people, or the children of some of the same people, that was doing this stuff. But all is not lost, friend. All is not lost. You look at this, oh my word, this is such a terrible thing. It's not lost. The populace, after a while, and this is decades of this, the populace sort of lost their appetite for all this cruelty and all this. And in the backlash, people began to reconsider the rightness and the propriety of what had been going on. And one of the first Puritans to stand up against this sort of thing, to say, hey, maybe we ought to not, poke holes in people's tongues so they can't preach, or cut people's ears off so they can't hear. Maybe that's not the Bible way to handle a church disagreement. One of the first guys to do this, publicly stand up against it, was a guy named Peter Folger. And he really embraced, or rather re-embraced, the original Puritan principle of religious liberty and tolerance. So Peter Folger is important for this reason. Not only is he one of the first guys to stand up against it, but he had a daughter named Abai Folger. Abai grew up, married a fellow named Franklin, and had a son named Benjamin Franklin. See, our buddy Peter Folger, he wrote a pamphlet against anti-Quaker and anti-Baptist laws. By this time, they'd gotten around to passing laws against Baptists. He theorized that Indian attacks and crop failures and other recent hardships endured by the Puritans just might be the judgment of God on the Puritans for how they treated their brethren. Looked around, the whole thing's falling apart, and he said, man, maybe we ain't right with God. And he passed that sentiment along to his daughter, who passed that sentiment along to her son. And Benjamin Franklin, for all his problems and all his shortcomings, he inherited the religious liberty ideal of the Puritans and the anti-slavery position of the Quakers. And that's why that is such a key part of the founding of America. God lined that whole thing up where an influential man had seen in his own family excesses and persecutions. And when he had a chance to make things right, he did his best to make things right. Well, there you go, folks. The cautionary tale with a somewhat happy ending. Just be careful. If you think you're right, just be careful. Because it's not enough to be right. You got to be right when you're right. You got to behave yourself. You can't be cutting people's ears off. You can't be drilling holes in people. You can't be silencing people. The idea in America of free expression is primarily an idea that rose out of a controversy over Bible doctrines. And the idea is that the way we as the body, we as a free people, we as a free people, the way we hash ideas out is not by banning them, but by discussing them. And the solution to bad doctrine is good doctrine. The solution to bad speech is good speech. And like I said, I'm an American. It's in our DNA, or at least it was, to think this way. I wouldn't, we go out there on the street, man. Somebody else come along and preach a Mormon gospel. I'm not going to call the cops on them. Someone wants to go out there and hand out Seventh-day Adventist literature, which has happened while we were preaching. I'm not going to call the cops on them. I'm free, they're free. We both do our thing. And in that clash of ideas, in that discussion of ideas, individuals can arrive at the truth. And I don't have the authority to abuse a brother in Christ just because we disagree. And we may never agree. And we may not have to have fellowship because the disagreement is so sharp. But this is not the same thing as marking people and opposing people that or contrary doctrine, blah, blah, all that stuff in the New Testament. Or some of that stuff in the New Testament. This is how do you process? How do you arrive at what's true? You arrive at what's true by discussing it. And I've got friends, man. Some of whom listen to this. I've got friends that we disagree sharply on some things, and I've showed them why I think this way, and they showed me why they think that way. At the end of the day, we say, okay, well, we've said everything that can be said about this topic, and we still disagree. And so what I did next is I bored a hole in his tongue and I cut his ears off. No, I just went, well, that's how it goes. See, that's what real religious liberty looks like. That's what real biblical Christianity looks like, in which every man is persuaded in his own mind of that which is true. And you're at liberty to try to persuade your erring brethren. You're at liberty to warn your erring brethren. You are not at liberty to oppress your erring brethren. You do that, man, pretty soon you wind up with this weird stuff where you're burning people at the stake and hanging them just because you disagree about the mechanics of salvation. Well, there we go. Puritans versus Quakers, the battle royale. Thank you for listening, guys. Thank you. Okay? All right, well, this is Michael. It's been the Street Preacher's Corner. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on the other side.